We are having an interview or a very nice informative session with Andrew Gebhardt, the author of the Holland Flowering, How the Dutch Flower Industry Conquered the World. Thank you for your time, and we're looking forward to hearing more about the book and of course, the flower industry as well. Um, what is the book about? What is the main focus of the book?
Um, I wanted to look at the world through the angle of the Dutch flower industry, which sounds like a huge undertaking, and it turned out to be that way, actually. I was living in the Netherlands, and it was a natural kind of curiosity. And the more I looked into it, the more curious and stuff I became. Basically, I'm interested in just in how we organize our economic institutions and the cultural values that go behind that go into that, to put it in a really broad way. But I actually organized the book around 5 or 6 questions, and I could tell you what those questions are if that maybe makes things a little bit more clear.
Please do, yes.
Yeah. So the first chapter, or the sort of introduction to the book, just takes a broad sweep of things. So it looks at how Dutch flowers crop up in all sorts of different areas, from the Israel-Palestine conflict to how we plan, in Dutch history, how the land was planned and organized, and it just gives a broad background into how this all came together. The first chapter looked at how did Dutch flowers become integrated commercially and culturally in the Netherlands. I think, like, when people think of the Netherlands, think of Holland, they think of marijuana, they think of prostitution, or they think of tulips. And so I wanted to look at that question, and I can then go into what I found. The next chapter looks at how this looks at the rise of Alsmeer's cooperative auction, which is where and how they grow the flowers in a town called Alsmeer, which is near Amsterdam. So how did this small town that's named for eel fishing come to organize the first flower auctions and then become the center of the world market? The third chapter looks at why flowers are sold by auction, and for that matter, why anything is sold by auction, from U.S. Treasury bonds to high art to stuff that police recover. Why, what is it about that form that fits with flowers and fits with some things but doesn't fit with others? And then also, how do Dutch horticultural auctions work specifically? So that's the third question. Fourth question was, well, what do flowers look like as commodities? And it turns out commodities are like a huge part of the world economy, from oil to especially food crops. And historically, there's some really interesting connections and parallels, which maybe we talk about, maybe we don't, but the book goes into, about connections between famine and social unrest and riots. People might remember just a couple of years ago, with the problem with the supply of wheat. Prices of bread went way up, and there were riots every place from Haiti to Egypt and so on. So what do flowers look like as commodities, and what has the Netherlands contributed to inventing or producing and marketing these commodities? And there's a whole interesting history about that ties in with Dutch still life painting and all sorts of aesthetic aspects of flowers. And then the last chapter looks at the question of why more and more of the flowers that are then sold in the Netherlands grown in other parts of the world, and how does it look kind of as a global industry. And for that chapter, I spent some time in Ethiopia, partly to investigate the question of why are more and more flowers that are sold in Alsmeer in the Netherlands grown in other parts of the world. You would think, it's really strange that, something as far away as Ethiopia, as Kenya, would be growing flowers that would then be sold and somehow still remain fresh, and it would still be profitable and so on in the Netherlands. So yeah, so I spent time investigating how and why that took place. And some of the part of the story might be familiar to people from other aspects of globalization, and other aspects, other commodities, and so on. But other aspects of it were very surprising, and also revealing about sort of the connections about how specifically the Dutch industry works. As this ends up happening, I guess, with many writers, once you become interested in a topic, then you kind of see the world through that lens, and that's what happened with me and the flower industry. So all kinds of crazy stories emerged. I tell a story of a tulip bulb trading scheme that involved Hell's Angels in the Netherlands. There's another one about this kind of eccentric figure, a Chinese Dutch guy named Yang Bin, who built a town resembling that was like modeled after the Netherlands, complete with like a replica of the Central Station in Amsterdam and the Hall of Justice and canal houses. I tell the story in the book, but it's basically he had a kind of a get rich quick scheme that was based on that. All of these kind of curious stories came together, but also within those curious stories, there were a lot of themes and patterns that emerged. And like I said, one of the main themes was just, how is it that we organize our economic institutions? I actually started doing the research back in 2008, so it's 2008, 2010. So it was really the early days of, at that point, the financial crisis, which grew into larger economic crisis, which we are still in. I find myself doing this investigation about the flower industry, and I felt, there's all these, there's war and famine and all these dramatic crises going on around the world. What in the world does flowers have to do with any of this stuff? And that's where it sort of emerged that it was like, oh, actually, this is a really interesting way of kind of angle to look at these sorts of things, because it turns out the Dutch flower industry is a cooperative. The way that they're sold is through an auction, and it's owned by the growers, and it's a cooperative. And it turns out that there's a lot of this model, which means unlike a corporation where basically many of the important decisions made, how are things produced, where are they produced, who gets the profit, those are determined largely by a board of directors. So if they decide, hey, well, we can move our factory to Mexico, we can move our factory to China, we can move someplace else, because production is much cheaper. Why don't we do that? There's every incentive for them to do that. And of course, from the United States, from the whole world, we know that we've been in a process of, what's called globalization for many years now, several decades at least, and have also seen how it devastates communities, and we're I think most listeners will be really familiar with that process. But a cooperative is organized on a different principle. So it's a one person, one vote, and they have a direct stake in how things work. They have a direct stake and a decision-making power over how profits are distributed and so on. So it's a lot more democratic. And it turns out that when given the chance to vote, most people say we won't vote our job away. We won't decide to relocate to China or to wherever, and we're going to keep things here. So as I looked into it more, this question of how we organize our economic institutions became really more and more interesting as I looked into it more and more.
No, thanks for the introduction, and we can move on to the those four key questions that you try to tackle in the book.
Basically, it argues that the flower culture really begins with the tulip. So many people might know that the tulip originally isn't from the Netherlands. It's from more Middle East, kind of Eastern Turkey, Iran, that part of the world. And it was also there was a huge flower culture based around the tulip among the Ottomans and that part of the world for many years, long before the Dutch knew anything about them before the Netherlands actually even existed. But it started entering the Netherlands through basically a single figure who was a Flemish botanist called Clusius. He was a collector. He was a botanist. He's one of these kind of Renaissance men figure who was really interesting and collected stuff. So flowers entered the Netherlands largely through him, and it emerged in this kind of culture where collecting was a big part of not only the Netherlands but that era in Western Europe. People had these things called curiosity cabinets, where they would collect all sorts of stuff, from exotic shells to flowers and plants to to different animals. And it was a sign of status, but these are also kind of the precursors of what later became museums, and also the precursors of what later became zoos. So these flowers entered into this kind of period of history, and it was right around the time of the Dutch Golden Age. So there was all sorts of economic practices that were going on. There was a time in the Netherlands where poldering was just getting developed. And poldering is where they clear parts of the land. They separate the land through levees and dikes, and they pump the water out using windmills. That's how that was a cutting edge technology at the time. And that enabled them to establish more fertile land for growing. And it was financed largely through the sort of an incipient state. And also that same scheme of financing went to fund a lot of their colonial adventures that the Netherlands was just embarking upon. Also for a search for spices. So they their early forays into Indonesia, and of course were based on this, and later also as well. I mean, the Dutch were everywhere in the world, right? So they and even here in Brazil, they had eventually had a Dutch colony. So all of this stuff was kind of percolating and going on as flowers emerged. So it was collecting, the still life painting. People are familiar with another thing that the Netherlands is known for. Flowers were figured prominently in still life, and those kind of worked. Those still life paintings worked to kind of stoke an incipient commercial culture, sort of like the way advertisements function today. So people would see pictures of these commodities, not only flowers but lemons and things like that, which were really extremely exotic in the Netherlands at that time. People had never seen. They weren't part of traditional diet. They didn't grow there, and in that day and age, things were a lot more. People didn't tend to leave their village, much less see the wider world. So these still life paintings that were looking at these commodities really kind of put a highlight, a spotlight on flowers, among other things. There was another period also where science was going on, so that was when the first kind of breeding started taking place with flowers, also partly through this figure of Clusius. And Clusius himself had networks, and in the day it was through writing letters. So he was connected to people from all over Europe, in addition to all over the Netherlands, that he would communicate with, that he would trade bulbs with. And it was a kind of a gentleman's society. And part of this gentleman's society was also people have these pleasure gardens. Prior to this era in the Netherlands, if people had gardens, they were really practical. They were for growing herbs, things that people would just eat. And for the first time, then it was the idea of cultivating a garden that would be reflect your property. They were called pleasure gardens. They would just be for pleasing the eye. Started to become popular, and tulips fit right in with that. So all of these things started to come together during that period with the tulips, with the still life painting, with this colonial exploration, with developing the land through polarization, through these pleasure gardens, and this kind of emerging, very, very masculine commercial aesthetic culture. That's largely how it got started. A decade by decade or a century by century account of how it connected. But those themes about about colonial exploration, being state funded, which I mentioned but didn't really emphasize enough, but that's a big part of how it got established. And these pleasure gardens, this aesthetic, this keen sort of aesthetic sense, this masculine culture, all of these things that were present in the early days in the 17th century, later and continue to be in the 20th century in sort of strikingly similar ways. A big part of how and why the flower industry works and why it works the way it does and so on. I should mention one other thing, because people have probably also heard of tulip mania. And I don't know if Manish, if you read this, because you mentioned you had read stuff about the flower industry, but there's a British historian named Anne Goldgar who has a great book called Tulip Mania that talks about what that phenomenon was all about. And it turns out that that's a really interesting, it's a myth, tulip mania. The myth, for people who maybe don't know about it, was that basically people were, the early auctions, I forgot to mention this, this was another part of the early Dutch horticulture and how this got established in the Netherlands. And this idea that there were this speculative market that emerged around tulip bulbs, and as tulips in particular, as flowers became more and more popular, people and a market was created for and a commercial appetite for flowers, and as it's a nouveau riche society also in the 17th century. This is the Dutch Golden Age. So this is the era when the Netherlands went from being kind of a backwater, poor, very rural place to being a much more urbanized, a commercial culture, and a wealthy society. In this environment, then people were going crazy and had this tremendous appetite, this voracious appetite for tulip bulbs. And then, as happens in sort of market crazes, the story goes, there was a crash in the market. At its peak, there was a tulip bulb that cost the same as a canal house, and then everything went bankrupt, and the country was nearly destroyed, and that's what gets called tulip mania, basically. And then we even in popular culture today, people are often when they want to talk about market crazes and stuff, people mention the South Sea bubble, or they will mention tulip mania as these kind of as example, as sort of historical precursors for something to happen. Anyway, Anne Goldgar shows that this is a myth. That there's no evidence, for example, that there was ever a sale of a tulip that was that expensive, that cost the same as a canal house and so on, and that actually there was somewhat of a market crash, but that it was not nearly as dramatic as it has a reputation for, and that in fact flower sales and stuff continued. But what the book is about is, she says, actually the real story of what happened is what's actually a lot more interesting. And what was really going on was that during this time when the early flower culture is getting established in the Netherlands, what happened was it was a transition from a much more local, rural, personal culture where agreements were made between people, where their trust was a much bigger part of economy. Where it was a much more informal economy. And that what was really going on was that this was a transition to a market-based economy towards, and a lot of historians beside her cite this as the Netherlands in the 17th century as the first example of early commercial culture anywhere in the world. And that what was actually going on was that sort of market forces were intruding on these areas that had previously just been established, where trust was just established between individuals, and so that this kind of disruption was what was the real mania, the real cause of the upset. Because there are like all sorts of historians have documented sorts of cartoons and stuff that came out at the time that just have people with wild looks on their faces and the supposed devastation that was the mania and then the devastation that was wrought by the tulips. All of that stuff, and like I said, the sort of main theme of the book is the how we organize our economic institutions. So just from that description of the early horticulture, maybe you can get a sense of how some of that stuff, how some of those themes were already playing out back then. So that's basically how the early Dutch horticulture got established. And then I was also interested in this question of these cooperative grower associations. So, how did it happen that this little town that was known for eel fishing, which Aalsmeer, aal is ear in is eel in Dutch, had been known for eel fishing, come to organize? How did it happen that they started organizing the first flower auctions, and then how did it happen that they became the center of a global market? So I can say a little bit about that.
Yeah, that would be
But this
helpful. We can explain that. Yeah.
this basically, so we started in the 17th century. This kind of just jumps then to the end of the 19th, the early part of the 20th century. The flower auction in Aalsmeer was established. The first one was established in I think 1912, and before that, in the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century, there were a number of fruit and vegetable auctions that started to be organized. And what ended up happening with the flowers was buyers could pit growers against each other. So they could always say, this price goes, this guy will sell me roses for 5 guilders, and this guy but your neighbor is going to sell them to me for 2 guilders. So it was kind of a race to the bottom for the growers, because the buyers were able to successfully kind of pit growers against each other, and it was sort of a race to the bottom. And many of them would go bankrupt. They couldn't maintain their business because the prices were so low. So what the flower growers did is they looked over at the cooperatives that the fruit and vegetable growers had done and said, oh, actually, they have a cooperative, and then they establish an auction to sell in order to sell this, and then bidders, people who want to buy, go to the auction and make a bid on things. And they're able to success, and because they all stuck together in a cooperative, they were able to establish more of a fair price for the flowers that they were growing. So that's kind of how that started. And it's interesting also to the sort of connections and parallels between establishing auctions and economic crises. Because in the late 19th century, there were both in Europe and of course in the U.S. there were all sorts of there was huge economic crises, and also in the 1930s, and where you see these economic crises, there's a direct relationship between them and the growth of cooperatives. And even just to jump from the Netherlands to give an example people might be more familiar with in the U.S. in the 1930s. Some of the agricultural cooperatives that were established in the New Deal later grew into, people are familiar with Ocean Spray, I believe Sun-Made Raisins, Sunkist, that now does oranges. All of these started off as agricultural cooperatives. And there was a connection between, how they emerged as a way of more fairly distributing profits, of having people feel more empowered and have more say about how their products are grown, where they're grown, and yeah, like I said, the distribution of profits. And actually, and even now, we're in economic crises. There's a tremendous growth of cooperatives and cooperative thinking. I think that's also this is a bit of a sidebar, but a really interesting topic that maybe we would talk about as well. is the role of more communally owned, more sort of a commonwealth idea of production that seems to be becoming more in vogue in the U.S. Also these days. In the Netherlands, this idea of cooperatives is really essential and really central to how the flowers became successful. One of the things that really struck me just on a cultural level was the difference between how people think about competition and cooperation in the Netherlands versus how they might think about it in the US. So these growers associations, there's a lot more cooperation going on than you would imagine in the US. So growers get together, they meet in clubs, they tell each other what different sorts of techniques that are really working. They share all sorts of things that I think in the US would be or are considered, well, I'm not going to tell you what's working for me because you are my competition. Why would I share that with you? But one of the sort of structural things, I think, consequences of having these cooperatives that are then sold at auction is that it separates the sale from the production from the sale. Just structurally, it starts to encourage this kind of more cooperation because growers what they have in common is they all want to create a really high quality flower, a really high quality product, so that they can do well at the auction. Instead of seeing, well, I'm just in this by myself, and my neighbor down the street who's also growing flowers, I'm not going to tell him what's working for me because then he might do the same thing, and then I'm going to lose out. So it's a really I found that really fascinating, and I think that also goes to explaining how they were able to start establishing a lot more success. Another way that this worked was as they were establishing this cooperative and sales at the auction. As the auction becomes profitable, they're able to invest some of those profits in infrastructural things, making sure that flowers are very successful in getting from the auction to the buyer. They also start attracting the interest as a local industry and more then increasingly as a state, as something that recognized nationally as an industry that the government wanted to support. They start attracting a lot of investment from the state. So in terms of the Netherlands, if you fly to Amsterdam, you fly to Schiphol Airport, and one of the reasons why Schiphol was located where it was, not the only reason, but one of the reasons, was that it was convenient. It was close to the flower auction. It's just 5 or 10 kilometers, maybe 10 miles or so, or 5 miles or so from the auction. The state did all sorts of other things in terms of highway infrastructure, even down to where traffic lights are built, and how all of these sorts of things kind of work together then to help foster a growing industry. I think when was it? It was the late 50s, early 60s when the Netherlands discovered gas in the North Sea. Then flower growers got a special discount on gas that was used to help power their greenhouses and so on. So there's all this kind of state funding, and this is again connects to the theme I was talking about that emerged in the 17th century. There's a lot of technological development that happened through an innovation that ended up coming out of through the cooperative structures and through state support. And then and just as this happened, then there's a lot of these are mostly men that are doing this growing. So this kind of masculine culture really emerged around the growing and selling of flowers in the Netherlands. Every year, production expanded. During World War II, and of course the Netherlands was occupied by Germany, by the Nazi army. Then during those years there was no production. And I actually interviewed a guy in the early part of my research, a man who had a really fascinating story, and he told me about he had grown up as a kid when the Nazis were occupying the Netherlands, and they occupied his family farm. And instead of growing flowers, they were then forced to grow food for the occupying army. very striking, and I asked him about a lot of questions about that experience. And one of the things that he told me that was really moving and really interesting was that even during this time, they would still sort of secretly cultivate their own flowers. And I said, why would you do that? Like in this, you're risking all sorts of things to do this, and what's the point? Because people sort of think of, these flowers are just it's a luxury that you can do without. And he said, that actually in these kinds of times that beauty is really important, and that this is a really strong symbol for him of peace and of resistance, and that's especially in those kinds of times where things seem really dark, that this kind of beauty and cultivating flowers seemed even more important. And it sort of rhymed with or struck me as there was an interview I read. I didn't do this myself, but I read an interview with one of the flower growers in Gaza who grow carnations, and many of these carnations are then sold in Aalsmeer, and they receive some investment from the Netherlands and so on. And during the Israeli blockade and then invasion and bombing of Gaza, one of the ones, because there's been many, in 2008, 2009, because of the blockade, the flowers were blocked and were not able to make it to market. And people in the Netherlands saw these images in the news of just heaps of rotting flowers, and that was as tragic for many people, or a good symbol as the suffering that people were going through due to the blockade and the bombing and occupation and so on. And they interviewed one of the flower growers about his activity, and then they mentioned that he was going to continue to grow, and said words that were almost exactly the same as the elderly Dutch guy that I spoke with about being occupied by Germany in World War II. It's about the importance of flowers as kind of this symbol of kind of peace and beauty, and that even in these kind of situations that they become actually even more important.
You mentioned earlier that the production grew every year after the World War II. What drove to the increase in production? Because Dutch are very good in crossbreeding, and that gave them varieties, and that also gave them certain unique flowers that other people were not able to replicate, and also they were able to transport that to a longer distance. That expanded their market. Would you explain why the production grew and why Dutch were able to sell more flowers to more people and to more countries?
There's a couple explanations for it. Some of it has to do, certainly locally, it has to do with with this infrastructure that was established, so that you can get fresh flowers very quickly and to market very, very easily. Because they maintain freshness, and because the price is low, people will buy them. And it's not just for special occasions, although Mother's Day is a big day, Valentine's Day, and so on. There are certain pivotal days that are huge for the industry. But even people will buy flowers on a day-to-day basis, and part of it is that prices maintained low. There are all sorts of, as the auction grows and becomes more and more popular, and becomes more and more profitable, they're also able to invest part of that funding in marketing. Actually, this is a similar strategy that Ocean Spray and Sunkist used. They would pool. They were small agricultural commodity cooperatives to begin with, but then they would pool their resources to help promote their marketing. So some of that happens as well in the Netherlands. I can get more into this when we talk about the aspect of globalization, but even the Dutch government, a lot of their development policies are very favorable to growers both within the country and encouraging them to move and grow in other places. So there's a in the same way that or not the same way, but a similar way to people that might be familiar with in the U.S. how we subsidize corn. The Dutch government does a lot of things that they're not direct agricultural subsidies, but there are all sorts of things that are direct and indirect, like I mentioned about the infrastructure, that really help to benefit the industry. Or having lower energy costs, or having trips that are fun, trips to visit Ethiopia, for instance, sponsoring that in order to help a flower industry emerge there. On the idea, from their point of view, as well, this helps sponsor development, and one of our goals is helping development in the third world. So there's all sorts of ways that are direct and indirect with that. And one other thing that I think is really important with the Netherlands is that it's a small country, and everyone seems to be just 1 or 2 degrees of separation from the industry itself. So it's not uncommon for people to maybe work in the auction as a summer job when they're going through college or even high school. It's not unusual to have someone in the family, a brother, a cousin, an uncle, so on, who is a grower, or is a trader at the auction, or has a flower shop, or is in some way involved in the industry. So there's this kind of cultural knowledge that emerges, so that even somebody who's driving a truck or who's handling the flowers in some way, that the equivalent in the U.S. would probably not have any sense about how to handle flowers, or, for instance, the importance of keeping cut flowers in a cold environment, would that's all lost. But in the Netherlands, it's one of the strengths that keeps the industry strong. And then there are other these kind of cultural factors too. And then of course there's this all sorts of technical innovation that happens from the level of greenhouses to the levels of breeding. And then I just mentioned, I spoke a bit about these cooperatives, but then there are all sorts of other cooperatives and organizations based around the flower industry. Oh, and this is another thing. I mentioned that state funding is an aspect of it, and I mentioned that it's a small country. That comes together also in the idea that there's often people, there's a kind of a revolving door of people. In the U.S., we think of a revolving door between maybe going through Goldman Sachs to then going into the Obama administration or something. But there, it's a lot of people that are involved in the industry are then also involved in government, and maybe go back and forth. And our other commercial interests. That like the current CEO of, well, he's not called the CEO because it's the head of the cooperative, but is the head of the Dutch flower auction, is the former CEO of Maersk, the famous Danish, and he's Dutch, the famous Danish transport company, one of the, I think it's the biggest in the world, or one of the biggest in the world. And
We're talking about Flora Holland, leader now.
Flora Holland, exactly. Flora Holland. And it's like, because Maersk that specializes in that infrastructure, they specialize in transportation. That's the sort of that's the kind of connection that, and they're global, obviously. That's the kind of why someone who would seemingly, on the surface of it, you think like, what does the flower industry have to do with this transport industry? But then when you look at it, one of the reasons for the success of the industry as it grew over the 20th century was just this infrastructure and planning that goes into it. So people probably know, you would know that, like, when you're selling a commodity like flowers, there are similarities with other commodities, but flowers have to be fresh. As soon as you cut the flower, like every hour, it is 1 hour shorter in its lifespan. So there's all sorts of ways of them, maintaining freshness, and it's really important. So now they've got these cool containers. Even flowers that are grown as far away as Ecuador. Ecuador and Colombia are more linked to the U.S. market, but some of the flowers in Ecuador then are grown and then sold in Aalsmeer. And often they're transported in these containers that manage to keep the flowers cool and fresh while they're shipped. So I think it's 2 weeks on a boat from South America to Northern Europe there, and so there's the Dutch were a big part of these kind of technological innovations of doing stuff like that. I mentioned infrastructure, but I didn't mention Rotterdam was the biggest harbor in the world until I think one of the harbors in China overtook it in the early 2000s or so. But it's still one of the biggest harbors in the world, and it's extremely efficient in moving stuff in and out. So they're just excellent in infrastructure and infrastructure, technological innovation, kind of state support. All of these kind of cultural factors of supporting each other, of trying to grow the best product, and do it as cheaply as possible. All of these things kind of come together to make them really successful. And then at this point also, then it's by reputation too. It's people, oh, Dutch flowers, that's going to be the best thing. This might be a good opportunity to kind of transition to start talking about the auctions, but so when people buy flowers, when wholesalers buy flowers, they don't want to just buy tulips. They don't want to just buy carnations or dahlias or whatever. They want to buy a variety. Most people want a bouquet with a variety. So if you're a grower, it's one of the functions then that the Netherlands has played is it's this kind of huge warehouse where all sorts of different flowers from all sorts of different places are coming together. And if you're a buyer, that's the place you want to be. That's where you can get the biggest variety at the best price, and then they're shipped out again. So you could be in someplace in Italy, and like the flowers that might have been grown just down the street from where you're living are cut and then shipped to the Netherlands, and then flown back and then sold to you. So it's a very it's a curiosity, but that's one of the it's through those logistics and through that infrastructure that the Netherlands is able to play that role.
The fascinating part of the Flora Holland auction, which I visited in Aalsmeer many years ago, is that it works with, as you pointed out, there's a tremendous variety available in the early part of the day, around as early as 4 a.m. and it's almost finished by 6:30, 7 a.m. And you have buyers from all over the world, and the price discovery happens in a very quick manner. But I think the important thing about the auction is that it really protects the interest of the growers first, and then comes the interest of the buyers. And if you want to give us a little bit more insights based on what you found while you were researching and writing this book.
Yeah, that was one of the big questions was, why are these sold at auction, as opposed to as other ways? I mean, we buy and sell things, all sorts of things in the world every day. If you go and you buy your microwave oven or whatever, it's not sold at an auction. Why is it that flowers, or why is it that oil ends up being sold that way? And there's I read a great book by a sociologist named Charles Smith, who spent like 20 years studying auctions of all sorts of different kinds. He came to many different sorts of conclusions, but one of the key insights was that auctions take place around commodities of uncertain value. They take place around commodities of uncertain value. And that value might be uncertain for all sorts of reasons. But if you think about it, like, for example, with agricultural commodities, because of things like drought, one of the uncertainties about it is their level of supply. So you don't know how from year to year or from month to month what that supply is going to be. And as we're seeing now with the oil market, there's all sorts of factors that go into that contribute to why it's an unstable kind of price. In the case of flowers, one of the agreements, since the auction is set up by the growers in the growers' interest, people will set a bottom line price under which they won't sell. That's partly what will guarantee a certain level of profit of them, assuming that their flowers are bought.
If you could,
Yeah.
explain a little bit to the average reader, who may not be aware of the scope of these auctions in terms of how many people from how many different kinds of or from number of countries who visit there, and generally how many growers are involved in it. It's, I think on the one side you're talking at least hundreds and hundreds of growers. On the other side you have buyers from as far as China and India and Russia, and of course on the other side from the West in the US and Canada as well. So it has the global scope, and that people may not realize.
That's actually an interesting point. Yeah, I'm not sure I remember the numbers off the top of my head, but there's somewhere around 150 countries grow or contribute to or flowers that are then sold in the auction are grown in close to 150 different countries. Although at least as recently as 2012 or 13, the majority of them were still grown in the Netherlands, although increasingly production is moving to other countries. Well, what's interesting, and one of the ways I think that the Netherlands keeps itself at the center of all of this, is that there's a lot of cultural cachet or cultural capital that goes into it. So in order to be a trader, to be a buyer at the auction, sometimes called the Wall Street of flowers, which is maybe not the best comparison, but you can get to get a sense of it. You really have to. Most of these buyers are Dutch, and if they're not Dutch, they speak Dutch, and they are very intimate with how things work in the Netherlands. Because if you're going to be a successful buyer, you have to understand all of this stuff, and the even though it's an international industry and things are and there's growing that takes place a lot of the growers themselves are also Dutch that have moved to move their flower farms to a place like Ethiopia or a place to Kenya or Ecuador or what have you. And then from them, they'll go on and they'll sell to wholesalers, and goes on down the chain to retailers and so on.
Maybe you can explain, as you were saying, that the Dutch farmers have grown in their scope of where they make or where they grow the flowers, and they've moved primarily into Kenya, Ethiopia, and many other countries as well. And why that has happened, and how it has changed other countries or impacted other countries as well.
Well, I can talk. A lot about East Africa, which is I'm most familiar with, but somewhat familiar with the growing practices in South America as well. Well, first of all, why would it be attractive? Some of the aspects of it might be sort of be obvious. Land is a lot cheaper in East Africa than it is in the Netherlands. Sun, you don't have to spend all your money on the greenhouse and on many of the things that you need to grow flowers. If you're in Ethiopia, for instance, and then particular flowers like roses, for instance, do really well when there's near equilibrium between day and night. So 12-hour day, 12-hour night. And along the equator is where you find that. So that's one of the reasons why, like Colombia and Ecuador in our hemisphere, in the U.S. hemisphere, are popular places for growing roses and so on. And then also why they became why East Africa became such an attractive site. And then labor, of course, is a lot cheaper, and that's from a grower perspective that's a big attraction. From a local perspective, that might be very, very frustrating. So an average wage in Ethiopia when I was there doing my research in 2010, 2011, you would earn I believe it was like 13 birr, which at the time was equivalent of like $1 a day for working, and many of them will work on a flower farm for 6 days a week. So it costs nothing for a grower to pay people that. And they can also have much bigger flower farms. So if you're in the Netherlands especially, but really anywhere in Europe, the typical flower farm in the Netherlands is like between 1 and 2 hectares. And then in East Africa and in Ethiopia, you can easily have 50 or 100 hectares. So you can grow a tremendous amount, a lot more. You get water essentially for free. You just bore a hole in the ground and so on. The government either sells you the land really cheaply, or in case in Ethiopia, they will offer, a 50 or 100-year lease, which essentially will cost you next to nothing. So it's really attractive. The problems then become with, from the grower's point of view, the problems become, well, how am I going to transport this to to my buyers? Because we're not selling it for a local market. We're still our market is still Europe. But this is another way also how the industry grows, because as they're expanding in these places, they also need chemicals. They also need they'll need some greenhouse technology. They'll need all sorts of stuff that are these kind of smaller industries that go into making the Dutch flower industry successful. And then they have other opportunities to expand and so on. And these flower they'll to do soil testing, for instance. A grower in Ethiopia is dependent in many cases on laboratories located in the Netherlands. That's one of the many ways that it gets that this kind of network kind of is maintained. And how these kind of more distant, like satellite areas then are also linked to the Netherlands. And if you want to, suppose you want to be an Ethiopian grower, you say, oh well, hey, there's this great flower industry going on. I'm gonna start my own farm here. Well, you've got a huge uphill battle, because you're not linked into these kind of these networks that are commercial networks, business networks, and that are also personal networks. And much less, having this kind of cultural knowledge about how the auction works, being member of the cooperatives, and so on and so forth. And it wasn't until 2000s, maybe 2004 or 5, that non-Dutch members were allowed in to be members of the cooperative.
Correct.
So it's
a recent phenomenon.
Yeah, it's a recent phenomena, and it's one of the ways that it's very much maintained as the Netherlands. There's all sorts of complaints then that people might be familiar that. Almost, it seems like every year around Valentine's Day, there's a flurry of articles of exposés on horrors of the flower industry. So people are familiar with, it's a place that mostly employs women. These women are horribly abused. Oftentimes, they're raped. They don't the labor standards, and in a place like Colombia or in a place like Ethiopia are not at all what they are in the Netherlands. Women are using are exposed to chemicals that cause spontaneous abortions, that cause their skin to shrivel up, that may cause cancer, that do all sorts of damage. Like I said, there's all sorts of sexual abuse, and then beyond that, it's like you're earning, if you're working every day, you're 6 days a week, you're earning $1 a day. Now, many flower farms actually pay more than this, I should say. I found that, but they're not required to by law. And doing, equivalent agricultural work, you're paid $1 a day, and that's, even according to the UN, that puts you below the poverty line. It's from a local's point of view, this flower production doesn't look so great. And like I said, around Valentine's Day, you'll tend to see a flurry of articles kind of talking about this, whether it's in Kenya or wherever it is. And it's particularly poignant then with flowers. And this is one of the things that the actual, like in a place like Ethiopia, again, I'm not sure of the numbers, but basically it's like the percentage of land used to cultivate flowers versus the percentage of land used to cultivate wheat or sorghum or soy or the other things that they might be growing, it's like, I don't know, something like 1%, or it's a very small percentage of it. But it gets a lot more attention because we have this kind of emotional association with flowers. You know, we have this sense, yeah, that they're of this emotional sense of this, that we're captivated by their beauty, and it just seems that much more horrible if there's, you know, if it's blood soaked that's producing this. Whereas actually a much bigger part of it is, you know, how green beans are produced, or how our wheat is produced. It's also quite ugly, but there's not there, and it gets some attention, but not nearly the focus of the that it deserves, and not nearly the focus that the flower industry gets. Yeah, and in the case of Ethiopia, another interesting aspect of this was that you hear a lot about the land grab in East Africa, and meaning like lots of other countries, United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia is a huge one, India is a huge one, China is a huge one, that buy up land in Africa for dirt cheap prices, and then they are grow food, which is then for export. So you run into, in the flower industry, there's a lot of overlaps with these other kinds of commodities in terms of what happens to local economies when it's like you have all this stuff that are grown for these products, whether you're talking about sugar. People know about the story of sugar and how that worked and is working, and how that leads to great profits for a few, but wreaks all sorts of havoc on the countries that are producing them, and that the countries that are producing them don't get wealthy by producing them. The profits tend to go elsewhere. So what happened in Ethiopia, what I found was that the opening, largely through, you know, these development funds and so on, opening this land originally for flower farms, then helped open this up to a wider land grab. So there's, like, you know, Saudi Arabia is a huge player in Ethiopia. China is an increasingly big player. Israel is a big player, and the U.S. is a big player. And there's that people might have heard about, because that does tend to get that does tend to get a bit more press. But it was interesting to know that in the case of Ethiopia, at least, it was the flower industry that kind of opened that Pandora's box. So I don't know if I could say a little bit more about that. What ends up happening then is that, like, for instance, say there's a flower grower, or say there's a Saudi who wants to grow whatever agricultural commodity they're going to grow. The state will choose to lease them a huge amount of land, and then that land actually may be occupied by people. Now, these people maybe have lived there for hundreds, or, you know, in case of East Africa, you know, thousands of years, but they don't have legal title to their land. It's not historically, culturally, and so on the way things have worked. You know, small time farmers and so on, they don't have legal title to this. So the Ethiopian government will just kick them off their land, and often, you know, using violence, using the force of the state, in order to lease this land to Saudi Arabia, or to whoever is going to be using it. I mean, a lot of people are displaced due to this phenomena. So that's, I mean, when we're talking about the land grab, that's a big part of it, and what that pushes pushes rural populations then to urban centers. It, you know, increasingly stresses the environment, has all sorts of devastating consequences.
Mm-hmm.
In the case of Kenya, people might, if you've ever seen the movie, I think it was Out of Africa in the 80s, with Meryl Streep and maybe Robert Redford, and it was this, this sort of beautiful, idyllic setting that was set around a famous lake in Kenya that later became an area of major flower production. And so it's a long story, and I'm glossing over some of the main points of it, but but really the flower industry had a lot to do with really poisoning that environment. So they were able to just siphon the water off the lake for growing their flowers. A lot of the chemicals that they use in the flowers then were, fertilizers and stuff got into the lake and poisoned the fish. It was a local economy. People had based a lot of their livelihood on fishing. There's the newer people that people may have read about that are cattle farmers, and also for people washing clothes and the rest of it. And so this tremendous resource started getting it's been poisoned, and it's had rapidly deteriorated, largely due to the arrival of the flower industry around the lake. I'm giving a dark picture of the role of flowers. I talk a lot more about that in the book. So if people are interested in more details about how that works, you can find that in the book. Their defense and in people in the flower industry's defense, and also a lot of the local politicians that support the land grab or support, in this case, the flower industry, will say, well, this generates foreign currency, which is hard currency, which is something we desperately need in this country. This provides jobs. People definitely desperately need work. So it's not a simple story of. I mean, there are many simple aspects to it, but some of the arguments that people come up with for reasons why it's supported, and why, hearing all these horror stories, you might think, like, why would the Dutch government want to support this industry that seems so ugly on the face of it? It's in the name of development. And that's the argument that comes up. Well, development is good for the country. It's providing work for people who need work. It's providing hard currency for the government, and so on. How effective it is in achieving those goals may be rather dubious, and especially in the case of Ethiopia. Now we have more than 10 years of evidence to look at the results of what's happened, and in the case of Kenya, many more years than that. But yeah, so that's sort of some of the back and forth of how that works, and why it's attractive to growers, and why that keeps expanding.
Mm-hmm. If you can explain a little bit more, where do we go from here? What's the future for the flower industry, or specifically for Holland? Or are there other competition rising on the horizon? Of course, China is a big market. India will eventually become a bigger market. But are there local competition coming for Holland or Dutch growers, or Dutch have certain advantages that they would be able to expand further? Where did your research lead, or how would you like to conclude, or your book?
I can say a couple. I mean, maybe this is a good transition then, to start talking about other background to the book and so on. But I finished most of the writing of the book already in 2012. So there's been some significant changes that have happened in the industry since then. And one of those changes is I talk about in the book the importance of place, and how the auctions are such a key. I mentioned also in our conversation about just how the cooperatives and how the auctions work, and why that's so essential to the success of the industry. But since then, the auction and the cooperative remain powerful, but the way that works is changing a bit. So there's a lot more selling that happens online, for instance. So it's less important for a buyer to actually physically be in the warehouse. There's still mostly local people, but there's more flexibility in that. And the reason why the place, I think, remains and will remain for some time important is because buying flowers is like is similar to like before you buy a pair of jeans, you're going to want to try the jeans on, even if you know the brand, even if you know your size and so on. It's not the same thing. And flowers are are a bit like that. So you want to growers really need to be able to see them, to touch them, and to be close on hand to make sure that everything that the product that they're buying is the best quality. And so I think even though it's shifting online, I think that place remains important. But that digital shift is really important. And the Netherlands, like both going back to the 17th century and now, is well known as being a kind of a middleman. And I think that's as the industry will remain extremely important. The Dutch will remain sort of the center of the flower industry, but what being in the center means is somewhat changing. So I think, like for example, in the case of China, you mentioned that it's this huge market. A lot of what's going on, and this isn't my area of expertise, but from speaking over the years with people in the industry that have spent time there and so on, it's a lot of that infrastructure. People who are experts in greenhouse technology, or people who are experts in different kinds of logistics or soil and chemicals that are used in production of flowers. It's those kind of middlemen stuff that become more and more important. Because then in the case of China, a lot of the growth is happening there, and they're envisioning a market there as well. So it's not like they're grown and then they're sold in the Netherlands and then flown there. But up to this point, it's still a much smaller slice of the global industry. Something like 70% of all cut flowers sold in the world go through the Alsmeer auction. So or go through an auction in the Netherlands. Flora Holland has 5 different locations, and I did most of my field work actually in the one in Alsmeer, but there are 5 or 6 of them. So yeah, I see it just I think I see it evolving. I see the Netherlands maintaining a pivotal role, but kind of a central role. But what it means to be in the center is evolving a bit, and some of that has to do with how the economic crisis is evolving, how the global economy is evolving, and particularly the sort of digital connection. So a lot of growers, they're members of the auction, but there's more flexibility in direct sales with people. So people can nowadays, like a grower in the Netherlands, for example, all of them will have their own website. And so somebody who wants to buy directly from them, they want to cut out the auction. There's more of an incentive to do that. If they're a member of the auction, they're not allowed to do that. So it would be because it undermines their own interest as a cooperative. But there's more, some people are choosing then not to be members. So there's a little bit more of a gray area happening with that.
Just a few questions about you, and how did you get interested in writing, and are you contemplating or working on any other book titles?
Well, I'm started off, and I'm mostly interested in writing poetry. So that's what I've kind of spent most of my efforts doing. I haven't published a tremendous amount, but I've spent a good chunks of my time reading and writing poetry, and that's still where my heart is. I had lived in I lived in Uruguay for a year. I had a Fulbright there, and I wrote a book, poems there, unpublished. But so my background is that, and then also I've written a few articles and nonfiction here and there. But really, poetry is kind of my heart, where my heart is. And I would say going into the future, one of the reasons why I'm in Brazil now, there's a couple of different projects. So I continue to write poems, and I don't know what the future of publishing in them will be. But I'm working on a collection that I'm tentatively calling Elsewhere and Otherwise. I'm also working on a nonfiction book here about an interesting community here in Brazil that were called the Confederados, which are they're descendants of Confederates from the United States that fled at the end of the Civil War in the South. Remembering U.S. history, know that the South was devastated at the end of the Civil War, and many Southerners fled, and about 20,000 of them found their way to Brazil. And when I heard this, I was like, I didn't know anything about this history, and thought this was really curious and fascinating. And I assumed, like many listeners might, that, oh, well, if you know, for instance, that slavery in Brazil wasn't abolished until the early 1880s, you might think, oh, well, these were 19th century Southerners from the U.S. They say, hey, well, we can't have slaves here anymore, but let's start our business then in Brazil. Wasn't so much of turns out that wasn't so much of a motivation, but they were welcomed by the emperor at the time, Dom Pedro, and who saw them as a great opportunity because they were for their agricultural knowledge. And in the 19th century, then it was Brazil was and even into the early 20th century, Brazil was known as the sort of Colossus of the South. So in the course of development, it was often imagined that that Brazil would be a much bigger competitor than for the U.S. So it sort of made sense in some ways for many of these people to come. They ended up founding a community. The town now is called Americana, which isn't actually far from where I am. It's in Sao Paulo State. And so my project is really just I'm thinking of doing a book about them and their descendants. And there's some curious stuff. There's some curious connections. One thing is apparently in the 70s, when Jimmy Carter came and visited Brazil, he's Rosalind Carter, the first lady at the time. She has descendants that were Confederados, and then here in Brazil there are some interesting connections as well. Listeners might know about Rita Lee, who was a member of a band called Os Mutantes, the Mutants. They were like a big 60s band, and she's a kind of figure that's sort of like Patti Smith, or she's a little bit older than that, maybe more like a Yoko Ono or Carly Simon kind of figure. But she's a descendant of these Confederados. So it's similar to at this point it's in a very amorphous project, and I'm not sure what central question it would be organized around, but it's a topic that I thought was really interesting. And it's, of course, for the town flag in this place in Americana was until very recently maintained a Confederate flag, but in Brazil it means a totally different thing to people. So I see this through my own lens, but for local people, they don't really see it that way, and may or may not be aware of that history. And many of the descendants of the Confederados are not white. They're not what we would think of as white in the United States. So there's this kind of really interesting kind of phenomena that's going on with that. So I thought that would be might be a topic for me to pursue along with the poetry.
Thank you very much for your time. It's been fascinating, and those who are interested in learning more about the flower industry and also the role of Holland in expanding and growing the flower industry, I would encourage you to pick up the book and read about it. Read the book, written by Andrew Gebhardt, the author of Holland Flowering: How the Dutch Flower Industry Conquered the World. Thank you very much for your time, and we're looking forward to talk to you more with your future books.
Great. Thank you, Manish. This was fun.
Thank you. Thank you very much.